name's Steve Parker. I'm from South Lancashire Bat Group, where I have multiple roles with the group, but the main one is as the trainer for the group, I guess. And I've been with the group sort of just over 20 years now, so quite a while. So South Lancashire Bat Group was formed in 1987. So we started as a group which did some surveys and some injured bat care and those sorts of things. But as time's gone on, we've really expanded, and we do really all sorts of stuff now to do with bats. If there's bats involved, usually we are somewhere locally. So that can be surveys. There's all different types of surveys, ranging from things where we go out with acoustic bat detectors and look for them and record what we're seeing and hearing on the detectors. We can go out with some more advanced gear now as well, so things like mist nets and what we call harp traps, and we catch live bats on some research projects. So those are still surveys and really very valuable to us. We have some surveys where we put some detectors up and we leave them for a year, just changing the batteries every now and then and replacing the cards, and re-record them, and we can analyse that with software now as well. So that's survey work is a big part of what we do. Injured bat wise, we do lots of rescue and rehab across the Greater Manchester area and just around the outskirts of that as well. So there's no real hard border, if you like, between bat groups. There's plenty of bat work to go around, and our primary aim with bat care is to rescue them, to rehabilitate them, and then release them back to the wild, of course. But sometimes you get some that don't survive, and then others which survive but not well enough to be able to go back to the wild. Okay, so they're two of the big things that we do, but we also generally spend a lot of our summer months doing bat walks. So we'd come to parks like Woodbank, or plenty of other places around the Greater Manchester area, and we will have 30-40 members of the public with us, and we'll give a bit of a talk, and then go and see the bats around the park, and explain what's happening. So it's a really great event for families to come to and enjoy our native wildlife. It's one of the few mammal species you can see really, really easily. Yeah, so today we are at Woodbank Park, which is a park in the Stockport area of Greater Manchester, just along the Goyt River Valley. It's a great site, lots of trees, lots of greenery, and the water that I mentioned, the river already, and it's a great river from bats' point of view, because it's bordered by trees pretty much most of the way along it, and it's down in the valley, which is a nice sheltered spot, so we get a lot of bats around there. And that's one of the reasons we've come here today, to come and see hopefully some bats later on when it starts to get a bit darker. Okay, so at Woodbank Park we've done quite a lot of survey work. So I think it was about 3 years ago, 3 or 4 anyway, we spent the summer doing some transect work. So we would come down with 10-15 people in the group, we'd split up and we'd each cover a particular area of the park, and we'd walk around and note down any of the recordings. So it's one of the surveys that we did. We also had some what we call Anabat express detectors, and these are a bit high tech. So we put ladders up, strap them onto a tree quite high so they're out of the way of people, and they're not obvious anyway, and we'd leave them there recording for a couple of weeks. I think we did that twice, and then we can analyse those calls through some software. It takes a bit of time going through them all, but we get a lot of data from it. The only disadvantage is it's just set in one spot for a couple of weeks while we do that, so we're only looking at one particular item. So we try and get them in different areas of the park. But also here we've spent a lot of time trapping bats, catching them in the wild. So that's for one of our projects that we're involved with, which is linked to Bristol University. So in the woodland here, right next to the river, this is one of the spots that we've regularly put one of our harp traps. So just between these two trees. So the trap itself is designed to catch bats as they're flying in the wild, and this is a nice little throughway where bats can fly straight away through, and we use a bit of a lure to be able to bring them in. They come and investigate the sounds that this lure plays. It's acoustic lure which plays out a sound for the bats to come and investigate, and hopefully then they end up getting caught in the trap. We don't take these things lightly, and we do have a license to be able to do it, but it's really enabled us to find some really interesting species. In fact, I think it was this particular spot where we caught the whiskered bat that we radio tracked last summer in 2019. We're hoping to do a bit more of that in the future, so it's a really good spot. Bats are flying through underneath the trees here. We've got lots of vegetation and lots of water, so we've got with the river here, so we've got a lot of insect food. We catch whiskered and brants. We also catch, they belong to a group called the Myotis, and Myotis means mouse-eared. So we've also caught Dorbenton's bats, primarily around the river, and Natterer's bats from that group. So they're the 4 Myotis species that we get at Woodbank. On top of that, we've had common and soprano pipistrel bats, and they're our most abundant British bats. And in the park here, we tend to find more common pipistrel. The reason they're relatively common is they've adapted to live in housing, and around the area here there's a great amount of greenery in Woodbank and the surrounding area, and it's all connected, which is great. It's one of the things that makes it a good site for bats. But there's also quite a lot of housing, and I know of one roost very, very close to Woodbank, in fact, where I rescued a bat earlier this year, baby bat, so excellent. It's probably coming down here to feed. We also get 2 other species that I've not mentioned yet, the Noctual Bat, which is the biggest British species, and also then the brown long-eared, which is a lot of people's favourite, just because they're generally seen as quite cute. This is one of my long-term captive bats. This is Frankie. He's a Noctual Bat, which is the UK's biggest species. I've got him because he came in injured a couple of years ago, just over 2 years now, and he had some really bad damage to one of his wings, which ultimately he lost, which meant that he could never go back to the wild. But I have a license to keep him, and I use him for events. He's an ambassador for bats, really. He's a very good one, I think, as well. He would never survive in the wild, which is why I've got the license for it. He will come with me to things like bat walks, bat talks. I use him for training and helping people when they're sort of dealing with injured bats. We find bats in Woodbank Park because there's 2 things that bats generally need. That's somewhere to live and something to eat. And the big thing in Woodbank that we know that we've got is plenty of food. All British bats feed on insects. So there's 17 breeding species in the UK, and there's 1 individual of another species. So we've got 18 resident in the UK. But all of those feed on insects. Bats worldwide can feed on all sorts of other things, but in the UK it's always insects. And that can range from midges through to moths. Some eat spiders, some eat larger moths and beetles even. But at Woodbank we've got a good amount of insects because of the diversity that's in the park with the vegetation. You've also got some open meadow areas, we've got lots of tree lines and really sheltered areas down in the valley. You've got the river that I've mentioned, which is a great source of insects. Insects, generally you find an awful lot around river and around trees at the edge of rivers, so it's a great place to watch bats because we'll often do bat walks in those areas because we've got a really good chance of being able to see them. But the other thing that bats need are roosts, and where a roost is that was the place a bat lives, or it shelters from the elements during the day before it comes out to hunt at night, of course. And around the area we've got there's potential for lots of trees, and I'm pretty confident that we've got roosts in trees locally. Don't really know of any, despite some of the survey work we've done trying to find them. But we do know that there's an awful lot of housing around here, and quite a few bat species have adapted to be able to live in buildings. It's one thing that Greater Manchester is pretty good for, is lots of buildings. So we've got the roosts, we've got the feeding site, so we should have the bats, and that's exactly what we find here. People can observe bats around Woodbank, well, in most places, to be fair. Okay, I tend to recommend that if they come out around about dusk, bats tend to start flying out around 15-20 minutes after sunset. So the best ways to see them is to stand, I think, directly under a tree line, looking out with as much sky in your field of vision as possible. Ideally, if you can look towards the northwest, that's one of the best directions to look, because it's the lighter part of the sky, it's where the sun sets, so you get better views for longer. A lot of people unfortunately do it the other way around. They're looking against the tree line, against trees, and you're looking for a small bat. It's that big, okay, with the wings out, yeah, they can be a bit bigger, but they're very dark. And as it's getting darker at night, it's getting harder to see them, and then you've got a dark background. So you've got a dark background, dark bat, darker light levels, lower light levels. Therefore, it's going to be harder to see, whereas if you've got them against the sky, you should really get some great views. And that's what we always try and do on bat walks. So we want really open areas with edges. That's one of the best ways. looking for them in woodland is actually quite difficult to do, especially when it's really quite dark. But sometimes we'll use an infrared camera with some lights on it, and we can get some good views that way. But more often than not, we're mainly doing acoustic surveys with those. Okay, so one of the things that we use when we're doing surveys, and we always use them on bat walks, is a bat detector. Now, a bat detector is something which it's got a microphone which picks up the sound that the bat is calling out, because all British bats use echolocation to find their way around and to be able to find food. And the way it works is that the bat flies along shouting out incredibly high-pitched calls. We refer to it as ultrasound because it's above the human hearing range. So normally we would not be able to hear this. A few children can sometimes hear one species of bat, which is the noctual, because it's just at the top limit. But in the main, we have to use a bat detector to be able to pick up the calls and transfer them to something that we can actually hear. So it has a speaker in it, and it plays out a sound which is a representation of the bat call. And from listening to the calls, then we can hopefully identify which species it is, and also what it's doing as well. The way that the echolocation works is, in effect, the bat shouts out some high-pitched sound. It shouts it out, and some of it dissipates off into the distance. It doesn't hit anything, so it doesn't create an echo. But the bits that do, so some of that sound will hit maybe a tree or an insect, and it will reflect back to the bat's ears, which will pick it up. And the way I tend to explain this is it's like us with our primary sense, which is generally sight, and what we do when it's dark is we use a torch, and the torch shines out a beam of light. Some of that light will then reflect off stuff, off the trees, and maybe some moths as well, and that's the bit that we pick up. Our eye catches that light, reflected light, sends a signal to our brain, which turns it into a picture of the surroundings. And a bat does exactly the same, but it uses sound, and it's sound that it generates. So it's this sound that goes out, some of it reflects, the ears pick it up this time instead of the eyes, and send the signal to the brain, and then that gets its picture of its surroundings. A lot of people ask me how it's best to connect with bats, and the nice thing is with bats is they're really, really accessible. Most British mammals are really tough to see, wild mammals this is. So when you go out and you look, you have to really look quite hard to see things like badgers and otters and even deer. So with bats it's very different. Often you can stand in your own garden or on your street, or certainly in your local park, and you can see them. And the one difference is that a lot of people, when they're walking around at night, don't look up, and that's all you've got to do. If you look up, you will probably see bats if you're in a reasonable habitat, especially somewhere like your local park or even your garden, as I mentioned. So it's great to be able to see what's there. And this year in particular, with the restrictions on movement and COVID, a lot of people have been getting out in their garden and watching bats and doing their own garden bat survey, which is a fabulous thing to do. And it's really quite interesting, some of the results that you find as well. And people are noticing things a lot more and becoming attached to them. And of course, when you find that you've got bats there, then the next obvious thing is to go and see, well, what are they? Let's find out about them. And with resources like the South Lancashire Bat Group website and the Bat Conservation Trust website and plenty of others, there's a lot of online really good information. Unfortunately, you have to make sure you're looking at the right stuff and the right sites for that, because there's some misinformation too, as we know. But there's a lot of good stuff with the proper organisations like ourselves and BCT. So one of the main things that people can do to contribute to the work of the Bat Group is by finding out about bats, some of the real facts about them, and understanding what they're really like. They're really quite incredible, amazing animals. They're a top predator, they're top of the food chain, they're a keystone species, and a good indicator of biodiversity. So if you've got good species richness at an area and good numbers of bats, then it's going to be one of a good environment and a good habitat, not just for bats but for other things, other animals and wildlife as well, and vegetation. So finding out about bats and spreading the good information and accurate information about them is absolutely critical. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding and myths about bats. They're not blind, they can see really well in low light levels. They all feed on insects. They don't generally spread diseases to people. There's a lot of poor information around that, particularly at the moment. And they don't damage buildings that they roost in. So they're actually pretty good animals to have around. Other things that people can do, they could get involved in surveys, and the word survey can sound a bit onerous to some people, I'm aware, but every year lots of people get involved in the RSPB's garden bird count, And we do a similar one with bats, which is obviously better because it includes bats, of course. So we encourage people to take part in those. And it's as simple as going out into your garden or your local park or just your local neighbourhood and noting down, do you have bats? And you can put the information online on the Sunrise Sunset survey with the Bat Conservation Trust. But also you can let the Bat Group know. If you've seen bats, if you've got bats in your local area, that would be great. We don't need to know the species. Great if you know them, but just knowing that there's bats there is really useful, and we have a form on our website which people can find. Also, people can enhance their garden for bats. They can encourage bats. We can use things like putting up bat boxes. We can put night-scented plants into the garden, things like stocks, evening primrose, jasmine, honeysuckle. Things that bring in insects during the evening. Bats can then have that food to feed on. And a pond. Ponds are great as well. Again, water bodies have good numbers of insects usually around them, so even a small pond can make a big difference, and that provides the bats in your neighbourhood something to eat. So there's an awful lot that people can do to contribute to, well, bat conservation in total, which is of course what the South Lancashire Bat Group is all about.